It's my great pleasure to be here for a conversation with Sally Kinoshita and Eli O. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about each of them. Sally is the Deputy Director of the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. She has worked in immigration legal services with the Asian Law Caucus, the National Immigration Project of the National Lawyers Guild, UC Davis Immigration Law Clinic, Northern California Coalition for Immigrant Rights, and the ACLU of Northern California. She's also currently a member of the Leadership Council of Educators for Fair Consideration, my organization. And welcome, Sally.
Thank you.
Eli O has been a nurse for 5 years and is currently a critical care response nurse at Stanford Healthcare. He first immigrated to the Bay Area from South Korea in 1999 at the age of 11 during the height of the Asian economic crisis. Eli received his associate's degree in nursing from De Anza College and later his BS in nursing from the University of Texas at Arlington. Welcome, Eli.
Thank you.
So I'm going to give an overview of what we're hoping to discuss tonight. First is an overview and update about what is happening with DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. We're going to get a chance to hear some insight from Eli, who is a DACA beneficiary and directly affected by policy changes to DACA. We'll also be hearing about other changes to immigration policy and how the political climate is affecting immigrants in California. And finally, we'll end with a call to action for how those of you who are here in the audience today can support immigrants here in California. So we're going to begin here by asking Sally to give a brief overview of the DACA program. Our time is limited, and we assume that many of you are here who've probably heard some about DACA already. So we'll just have a few minutes on this, and if there are more detailed questions, we'll have an opportunity later to go into more detail. But
Great.
Just an overview.
Thank you, Kathy, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. As Kathy said, we thought we'd start with just setting the ground a little bit so everyone is on the same ground level in terms of understanding what the DACA program is. DACA is the acronym for the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program that was announced by President Obama under his administration in June of 2012. And what it did is it directed the immigration agencies to exercise their prosecutorial discretion to not detain or deport certain undocumented young people that were in the country at that time, had been here since before they turned 16, had been in the country at that time for more than 5 years, and were under the age of 31. It also had certain educational requirements and required that people pass a criminal background check. People who benefited from this program were able to get protection from deportation and a work permit, and from that also flows other benefits like a social security number, the ability to access the banking system, credit cards, bank accounts, car loans, et cetera. What we know about this program at this point is that almost 800,000 people benefited from the DACA program. Slightly more than half of them are women. 2/3 of them are 25 years or under, so they're fairly young still. About 80% of them were from Mexico. So the vast majority of DACA recipients were from Mexico, but a wide variety of countries there were individuals who received DACA that come from a wide variety of countries. Here in California, about 225,000 people benefited from DACA, which represents about 28% of the country's DACA recipients are here in our state. What we've seen through surveys and research since then is that the DACA program increased higher education attainment, it boosted the workforce, it helped boost the economy during that time. But despite the success of the program, President Trump on the campaign trail, and since he's become president, has really sought to dismantle the DACA program and has made several attempts to do so, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So that's just sort of a quick overview of the DACA program.
Thank you, Sally. So I'm very excited to have Eli here. I have known Eli for many years before he got DACA, and he's always been someone that I have thought about. Well, there's many people I've thought about, but Eli's been someone that I've particularly thought about in thinking about the impact of the program and seeing sort of his life sort of before and during the program. So I'm hoping that we're going to have an opportunity to hear about this, and you guys will have some of the sort of information that Sally just presented come to life for you. So Eli, can we start by asking you to tell us a little bit about what your life was like pre-DACA, and maybe particularly in the context of your desire to pursue a career in nursing. Sort of what was some of the educational obstacles you faced and the career obstacles.
Yeah, so when I was going to school in California, that was really tough time for undocumented youth because at the time, I had in-state tuition, but that was the only benefit. So I didn't have any kind of help from financial aids. I wasn't able to officially get a license in California as a nurse. So a lot of programs that were not accepting nurses if you were undocumented. I also couldn't drive legally. I couldn't work legally. So the challenges of trying to afford an education in California it was pretty tough. But somehow I was able to figure that out and jump over some of the obstacles and eventually get my nursing degree. But pre-DACA was a pretty rough time, I would say, where really just my options were very limited, almost like a glass ceiling, if you will.
So Ela, you talked about how there was definitely financial obstacles for you to get an education, and even many programs weren't even open to you. They wouldn't allow people without Social Securities or work authorization to be able to enter into nursing programs. Can I take it one step back and ask why were you so committed to a nursing degree? Like, why did you think that there would be an opportunity for you if you worked hard enough and you sort of and were assiduous enough in finding these opportunities?
Yeah, so I kind of grew up hearing about DREAM Act since I was in junior high, right? So Senator Durbin talked about it for ages. So I knew growing up that sometime in the future this might pass. And that was kind of my hope every year. So throughout high school, every year I was like, maybe next year it'll pass, maybe next year. So I thought maybe if I get my education and I'm just in the right place at the right time, I'll be able to start my career once that passes. So that was always the plan.
Okay. So you got you got an associate's degree here. You had to go to another state to get an online program to get your BS, and then you had another state that you got your nursing certificate from. And once you had all that in place, again, this was pre-DACA, what were your options to actually work as a nurse?
None, actually. So nursing is highly regulated. You have to be licensed. You have to have a Social Security number. You have to be a legal resident. You're taking care of a human life, right? So the accountability is pretty high there. So you can't just go out and just get a job as a nurse under the table. So I was working under the table as a waiter for many years, but that was my literally only option at the time. So I had a bachelor's in nursing. I had critical care experience as an internship, but I was just wiping down tables and serving sushi because that was really my only option at the time. So,
did you at that point consider a different career?
Well, even if I chose a different career, if you can't legally work in the country, your options are limited, right? You can't legally drive, you can't legally work. Really, what career is there that can help you be part of society if you can't legally do anything? Right?
So DACA happened. How did you find out about the program? What did you think about it initially?
So I think I was underemployed at the time. I was working part-time as a waiter. I had my bachelor's degree in nursing. And I remember I was oversleeping and someone texted me, hey, Obama passed something. So I'm watching the news and I was just kind of shocked, wow, something's actually happening. And so it took me totally by surprise. I was fairly depressed because I didn't have a lot of options at this point, about a year after getting my bachelor's in nursing. So it was kind of a risk. We weren't sure where this was going to take us, but the benefit outweighed the risk, so we just went for it. So group of us just jumped at it. So
how many months after the program was announced did you apply?
I think it was maybe a few weeks, actually. There's not a whole lot of other options out there, so you just kind of take what you can get.
So once you did receive your work authorization and were eligible to work, did a job just find you like that?
No, actually, at the time, they were only hiring nurses with experience in California. So I couldn't get a job here in California. So I got a job in North Dakota, of all the places. And it was negative 20-degree winter. It was cold. But that was the only job I could find. So I was like, all right. They were really hurting for nurses because of the oil boom. So I went out there for a couple of years and got my critical care experience working in the ICU. So that was kind of my first experience in nursing.
So you're now at Stanford. You've been there for?
A little over 3 years now.
Okay. Do you think your immigration status affects your work there? How would you say your sort of immigration background or experiences influence how you are as a nurse?
I think it affects my work ethics, right? I mean, I've seen my dad work 7 days a week, 12, 13, 14-hour days. So I remember, like in North Dakota, people would see me smiling at work, and they're like, "Why are you smiling? You're getting paid $20 an hour. You're working somewhere in the middle of North Dakota, in the middle of nowhere." But I'm like, "Well, I can legally work as a nurse. Like, I've never had this opportunity before. So just the chance to legally work was a blessing for me." So people are always like, "Why are you smiling?" But it just gives you a different work ethics when you realize work is a blessing and a privilege when you can't always legally do that.
Can you tell us ways that DACA has affected your life besides your ability to work?
I think just the freedom and the sense of security. I can travel the country and not worry about what's going to happen to me. So pre-DACA, I mean, there were a lot of uncertainty in life, but also if I traveled to certain places, what would happen to me? But finally, after DACA, not only was I able to work legally, I could travel legally and not worry about any consequence. So just a sense of security was actually pretty big, the fact that I can legally be here now.
Great. So, Sally, can we ask you to talk about the threat to DACA? So what has happened since the Trump administration, and where are we at with DACA right now?
Yeah, just to, I guess, go back a little bit, something Eli said reminded me about where we even started with DACA, which is that we often credit President Obama for introducing this program, and certainly there's a lot of gratitude that it was even made available during his administration. But DACA actually probably started years ago with the DREAM Act, and the DREAM Act has been in the news a lot lately, but the DREAM Act was actually originally introduced in 2001. So it was a long time coming. We're still working on it. We're still talking about it in Congress. But the first DREAM Act actually was introduced in 2001 and kind of sometimes seemed like it might happen and didn't. As Eli said, from year to year, we thought maybe this will be the year. It kept not happening. Congress couldn't pass a DREAM Act despite many attempts. And finally, immigrant youth really decided to take it upon themselves. And if Congress couldn't pass something, they put pressure on Obama. And what we saw were undocumented youth really willing to take great personal risks to push this program. And as an attorney, I'm an immigration attorney, we realized how much we're risk averse compared to the community sometimes. We saw immigrant youth committing acts of civil disobedience, getting arrested, taking over John McCain's office and having sit-ins in ways that as attorneys we'd say, that you shouldn't do that, you know, you're particularly vulnerable as undocumented young people. But it was really the undocumented community, those who would be impacted by this program, that pushed for it to happen. They pushed for it to happen, and Obama, through an executive order, announced this program. That meant that it was quite vulnerable to being rescinded or taken away by a subsequent president through an executive order. So we had this program for years, as we talked about. It was very successful. And then in September, President Trump announced through his Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, the end of this program. And what he said in September was that the program would end 6 months from that date, which would be March 5th. People were given 1 month. If you want to renew, there is a certain subset of you who can renew your DACA, but only some of you. And after that, the program will end starting March 5th, and slowly but surely, people will just expire. In other words, when you get DACA, you only get it for 2 years. So if people aren't allowed to renew after that 2 years hits, it would expire, their work permit would no longer be used. It looks like a California ID almost with an expiration date. They wouldn't be able to use that to work. They would also not have a lot of the other benefits that come with it. So he announced the end of it back in September. He also said it ends March 5th, meaning no one after that date can renew. Thousands of people starting that date will start to lose their DACA and then be vulnerable to deportation and not be able to work. He also set that March 5th deadline for Congress, saying you need to act by this date to pass something. An executive order like this that helps some people isn't good enough. Congress, you need to pass a DREAM Act. You need to figure this out and have a permanent legislative solution. So subsequently what happened was in January here in San Francisco, a federal district court said the Trump administration couldn't do that. They barred the termination of the program. So they said, the Trump administration, you can't just arbitrarily and capriciously end this program with no stated reason. You can't do that. You haven't stated a good reason to so quickly end it. You have to restart it. For those who have it, they should be able to continue renewing. So that happened, and it was also another court, federal district court in New York, said the same thing, and DACA has now been restarted. Those people who have DACA or have had DACA can continue to renew it. the Trump administration asked the Supreme Court to sort of leapfrog the regular appeals process and hear the case right away. Just yesterday, actually, the Supreme Court said, no, you have to go through the regular appeals process. We're not going to look at this case ahead of schedule. So as of today, the DACA program remains partially still in effect. Those people who have or have had DACA can continue to renew it. No new applicants for DACA can be approved, but those who have it for now can continue to be renewed. It's still going to wind its way through the courts. The executive branch, President Trump's administration, could still try to announce something else to try to end it, which they probably will. And Congress could still try to act and pass a legislative solution. There's a lot of confusion about the March 5th deadline because he called it a deadline for something to be done. And it's kind of interesting because when we think about, is it a deadline, the fact that he even introduced it on September 5th was a deadline that was set for him. So some attorneys general and one governor said to Trump, hey, if you don't do something about DACA as per your campaign promise, if you don't do something by September 5th, we're going to sue you again. And that's why he introduced this announcement on September 5th. Then he set this March 5th deadline, but nothing really is going to change as of March 5th related to the program.
Sally, can you talk a little bit about the people who have not applied yet for DACA? So you clarified that the people who already have DACA can continue to renew, but there are no new applications. So what is this population of people who might have been eligible but did not yet apply or did not choose to apply?
Right, so the original estimates were that about 1.2 million individuals were eligible for DACA, and as we mentioned earlier, about 800,000 applied. So there are hundreds of thousands who probably were eligible that didn't, and that could have been anything from not knowing about the program, not knowing about their eligibility, not being able to afford it, as well as people have to be 15 years old to be eligible or to apply for the program. So every day we have undocumented young people who are aging into the program, turning 15 years old and only now becoming eligible. Those young people now can't apply under the current processing, but as it had been before Trump's announcement, they would have been able to apply as soon as they turned 15. So that probably represents actually the largest chunk of people who have not yet applied and benefited.
Right. And I think in many ways that's one of the great tragedies that a lot of people do not hear about because we sort of focus on these 800,000, the stories of people who've had it. But there are so many people who were going through middle school and high school, hearing about DACA, assuming that they would have it, and really looking forward to it, and hearing from older siblings or cousins or classmates about the benefits of the program, and now really feel completely unprepared about how to move forward with their education. Those are also the young people who came the earliest. They were quite young when they came to this country in order to have, if they were not yet 15, but and arrived before 2007, these really were small children at the time of their arrival. And as one could guess, they feel the most American because they have lived here for so long and grown up so closely with their native-born peers. Eli, can you talk to us a little bit about what it's been like to sort of go through the last year plus of sort of hearing about the plans for DACA, the changes to policy, the proposed changes, the fights for it. How have you weathered these storms?
Well, so I don't think any of us in the DACA community expected Trump to win. I don't think anyone did, right? So when that happened, it was kind of like, oh, wow, panic mode. So there were a lot of dramatic emotions up and down between me and my friends. But, you know, before DACA, we were dreamers, right? And as dreamers, I mean, I've been living here for almost 20 years now. Come July, I've been living with uncertainty for a long time. So you get kind of used to it, right? Like Malcolm Gladwell talks about this with the London bombing, that people in London actually got used to it and they became more resilient because they realized that you can't worry about things that you can't control. So that's kind of what we decided, I think, almost as a group, is that, well, you know, Trump is going to change his mind every day. The media is going to overreact and say what they want to. We're going to control what we can control, right? So I'm not going to panic and be afraid each day of my life what's going to happen tomorrow. I'm just going to do what I can control. So that's kind of what we try to focus on. I think between me and my friends, when we talk about it, it's really what can we control?
So I guess tangibly, if you were to lose your work authorization, lose your protections from DACA, what would start to happen? What would happen immediately? What would start to happen?
Yeah, so eventually my work permit will expire. The one I have right now probably will expire into this year. But obviously we can get renewed. But once that's gone, then I will lose my job. Yeah, I won't be able to legally work in the U.S. anymore, and I have no other option as a nurse. So eventually I would have to either go to Canada or Australia, where they will hire nurses. So it'll take me about a year to transfer my certification, take the test. That's one option. Or I have to go back to Korea, which I have to go to the army, and I don't speak Korean well enough to be a nurse in Korea. I would have to just get a different job and transfer careers. And obviously my family's here, so and I get a 10-year bar, so I can't come back and see my family or my friends. Yeah.
Let me, if I can just sort of parse that out a little bit. So you would lose your job. Is there any possibility Stanford would just choose to keep you on, would sort of turn a blind eye? You're such a valuable nurse. You've been there for so long. You're sort of beloved by your colleagues. Isn't there a way for them to sort of work it out with you?
No, I mean, for most of us who are dreamers, there is no legal option, right? So we don't have an option to simply continue working without DACA. So unfortunately, there's no other way for us.
Can you talk about what happened at Stanford? You actually had a renewal that came late, so there was a period that you did not have work authorization. And how quickly did Stanford need to act upon that?
Yeah, so they were actually really generous and supportive. So last year, there were a number of dreamers who lost their DACA for a couple months because it was delayed for some reason. So I had 2 months where I was not working. And Stanford graciously gave me a leave of absence for those 2 months. They actually gave me another month, so they were going to wait 3 months for me. But then the work permit finally came in after 2 months. So, but yeah, they were very supportive and understanding and gave me that 2 months of leave of absence, so I didn't lose my job.
So you didn't lose your job, but you obviously were not paid during that
Yeah,
time.
no, I was not getting paid.
But that would not happen if you were to lose your work authorization, have nothing in the pipeline to renew.
Yeah, if there's nothing in the pipeline, they can't just leave you on leave of absence for more than like 1 month at a time. So really, they would have to let me go for HR policies.
So are there any, is there any ability for you to work as a nurse as an independent contractor or sort of, not as an employee?
I'm not really sure about the legal ramifications of that. Yeah, I don't think that would fly. I mean, I might be able to find some odd jobs doing that, but it wouldn't be a career. It'd be like maybe doing some kind of home health nursing occasionally, but I wouldn't be able to like make a living doing that. Yeah, and that's also questionable legally too. So I'm not sure how that would work out. But definitely, as far as career goes, working in the hospital, it would be the end.
So you have a choice if you are to lose your work authorization for leaving the country to continue in your nursing career that you've invested how many years in now?
5 years of extra working and then schooling, probably another 5-ish. Yeah.
So 10 plus years,
yeah.
of investment in that career. So the choice would be to sort of leave the country to continue that career, or which would mean leaving behind your family.
Yes.
So, thank you for sharing. Sally, can you give us a little bit of context on Eli's story? So, for other young people who have DACA, what are some sort of differences in other types of stories or other types of experiences? How might losing DACA affect other young people's lives? What are some of the risks and threats that they might experience?
Yeah, earlier you were talking about that. That there are a lot of people who were very young when they arrived, and then even when they applied for the DACA program. I think I mentioned earlier that the average age is under 25. So at this point, if someone were to be eligible for DACA, they have to have been in the country for over 10 years, because you have to have been here since before June 2007. So what we see now are sort of a generation of very young people who didn't really have to face the full consequences of being undocumented yet. If you're in high school, you may not have yet applied for a driver's license, applied for federal financial aid for college, needed a social security number to apply for college, or you were young enough that you haven't sought employment yet. There were a lot of young people, hundreds of thousands actually, that got DACA before any of those needs came into place. When they were 15 or 16, they got DACA and all the benefits that flow from that. what Eli describes as life before DACA was really what some people call the undocu hustle, like really having to hustle. How do you figure out how to go to college if you are not eligible for federal financial aid and you're going to do your own fundraising to pay for that? How do you figure out how to navigate a system where you can't work, but you want to get work experience? Think about later how you're going to get into a career. There was a whole generation of young people that pushed for this DACA program that really knew that hustle, that really were resourceful and figured out how to navigate a system where so many options weren't available. What we have now are a lot of young people for whom they hadn't had that struggle, but they're now facing the same fear without having had the chance to exercise that muscle to figure out that resourcefulness. So the anxiety is super high. You know, in talking to Eli, there's a certain matter-of-factness about, well, if this doesn't work out, I'm going to figure it out. I might have to figure it out in another country, but I'm going to figure it out. There are a lot of young people who hadn't figured that out before, and they're super, super anxious now. And there's the added fear of being anxious and fearful about their parents. Because there's so much targeting of immigrants in general, many undocumented young people and many U.S. citizen children actually have undocumented parents, and so there's that added anxiety as well that we're seeing that's really kind of bubbling up to a level of a mental health crisis at this point in the immigrant community and for many surrounding communities.
Yeah. I would say also for the younger people who did not know, were not adults pre-DACA, a lot of them also have never disclosed their immigration status to people. Since living with DACA and having work authorization, California having a driver's license, having access to in-state tuition or state-based financial aid, they really haven't come forward about their immigration status, and then were they to lose it, they really have not had the experience of sort of advocating for themselves and knowing how to seek out support after having revealed their immigration status too.
Right.
Sally, maybe we can expand outward and touch on other immigration issues or other immigration policy changes that are happening. Of course, many of us have probably heard of Trump's 4 pillars on immigration. So maybe we can start with sort of the broader federal sort of proposed changes and then sort of hone in on what's happening in California.
Right. Yeah, we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the other policies and changes in immigration law, and I almost didn't know where to start. I mean, first of all, there have been so many. It's been a sort of unrelenting drumbeat of anti-immigrant rhetoric as well as policy. And so I think one way that I was thinking about it is that there have been changes at the executive level in terms of things that have been announced by the Trump administration, policies that have been proposed, and there have been changes in tactics, just how they go about enforcing immigration laws and benefits, as well as just how they're prioritizing things. So some of the things, we're about a year into the Trump administration at this point. Almost immediately after his inauguration, he released a number of executive orders, things out of the president's office that sought to change immigration policies in some cases. Some of them were, for example, a change in enforcement priorities. Who is immigration going to go after for arrest, detention, and deportation? One of the things we saw out of that was that basically any undocumented person at this point is a target for immigration enforcement. If you're here without status, immigration is prioritizing you to detain and deport. This is a little different from almost every prior administration that recognizes that we can't prioritize everyone, that especially now with somewhere between 10 and 12 million undocumented people in the United States, and 1 in 5 children in California with at least one undocumented parent, that if we were to target and actually remove all of those undocumented immigrants, not only would communities collapse, but so would economies in the United States. But this administration has sought to target all undocumented people. We've also seen the targeting of, or the restriction of immigration from certain majority Muslim countries, as well as the refugee program. The so-called Muslim ban has actually failed multiple times because they've introduced it in various ways over the past year, but it always fails in the courts. We also have seen the end of other programs similar to DACA, other programs that have identified certain populations of people for protection from deportation, as well as allowed them the ability to have a work permit. For example, temporary protected status. Temporary protected status is a designation that the federal government can give to nationals from certain countries if their country is facing civil strife or has suffered a natural disaster or other emergency situation. There are a number of countries that have that protection and designation, and hundreds of thousands of nationals from those countries currently live in our country, most numerously from El Salvador, Haiti, Honduras. Those are all being stripped away, all of those benefits. So those are all announcements that have been made out of the executive branch, out of President Trump's administration. However, they're also changing their tactics without having to change the laws. So for example, I think many people in this room probably know that under President Obama, we actually had record numbers of deportations, higher than any president previously. That has continued in terms of the arrests under the Trump administration. We've actually seen a greater than 40% increase in immigration arrests since President Trump became president. However, there have been changes in tactics. So what we see under President Trump is really targeting people outside their homes, outside their workplaces, sowing fear in the community by targeting sometimes high-profile, undocumented young people who are speaking at press conferences, et cetera. And really targeting people like temporary protected status, other individuals who've been here for a long time, saying you're going to lose your status, and sending hundreds of thousands of people into undocumented status. So ironically, even though President Trump is talking about trying to reduce the number of undocumented immigrants in the United States, by taking away temporary protected status and DACA, right there alone, we probably have 1 million people who will become undocumented with the stripping of these programs. And we also see other kind of insidious things on the processing side. So a real slowdown in immigration in terms of how quickly or how slowly the processing is for naturalization to get a green card. So right now we're seeing it takes a lot longer to become a US citizen or to get a green card. They're simply slowing down a lot of those processes, as well as targeting people who have, under other administrations, would have been left alone.
Thank you, Sally. So Sally talked about the fear that is sort of pervasive in the immigrant community and the many ways that the Trump administration has been fomenting that fear, and the ways it has caused many people to retreat into the shadows. Eli, one thing that has struck me is that it's actually been the Trump administration that has caused you to start sharing your story. And that at first sort of struck me as ironic, but I want to hear your perspective. What is it about that has happened that has made you feel like now is the time that you should be telling your story?
Well, I think when Trump won the election, we realized that they have our information. So you can't hide when they have your address and your work information. So really, I had nothing to lose, to be honest, because once they know your information, they have it. But on the other hand, there was a sense of injustice where I felt like they were painting us not in the greatest picture, right? His rhetoric about immigrants in general wasn't favorable. So I really wanted to speak out when people were asking to share my story. I was like, yeah, sure. Actually, I pay a lot of taxes. Like, I pay a lot of taxes as a nurse in California. Like, and I obey all the laws. I'm a good nurse. There is a nursing shortage in America. And they're constantly asking me to get a new job as a critical care nurse all over the country. So why is it that I shouldn't be legalized, right? Why is there an obstacle? So I thought speaking out, not just on my behalf, but for my friends who are teachers and engineers and students, I thought for their sake too, that I should speak up.
Thank you. And could you give us a sense of what the reaction has been from the people who've heard about your story for the first time or heard about your immigration status for the first time?
Oh yeah, so a lot of people at work now know about my status after a couple of articles were posted. And they were pretty shocked. I think I'm not like the typical undocumented person. But at the same time, I think the story is complicated, right? So DACA is a very complicated process, and there's renewal, and the news is changing every week. So it's hard to explain to my coworkers what exactly is happening. So while they empathize, they are so confused, like what's really going on? Like, so it's hard for them to understand all the pieces.
Thank you. It is 7:05, and it is now time for us to be able to answer some of your questions. So I have a whole stack here of questions, and it's going to take me just a moment to try to read them all quickly. So I'm going to actually just go for one of the first ones here and then have an opportunity to read through them. And I should note that after this half an hour of reading these questions, then there will be an opportunity for you guys to ask us directly your questions. So we'll turn off the cameras and the recording and then give you an opportunity to engage with us directly. There's a couple questions here for Eli, asking questions about how he would talk to younger undocumented students. So I'm going to give you a couple of these. So one is quite general. Eli, what advice would you have for undocumented young people?
I would say to get your education. Yeah, I mean, education really is power. So the more degrees you have, the more experience you have, the better off you will be. You don't know what's going to happen in the future, but you can control what you can study, right? What kind of work you're going to get into. So I would choose that very carefully. Like nursing for me was a very practical thing. And it has worked out well, right? So you really want to be careful about what you're choosing and what kind of experience you can gain. But the more education you have, better you'll be positioned when something happens to get that job and to move forward.
That reminds me, one thing that has always struck me is you once told me that you thought some of your greatest preparation in being a nurse was actually being a waiter for so many years, and that you were, reasonably smart and got a good education, but actually it was all of the years being in customer service that made you someone that people really wanted to work with. Could you talk about that? For someone who might be an undocumented student and not be able to have their dream job right away, but doing work that they might have to do, how might that in fact be preparation for later?
Yeah, so undocumented hustle, as Sally mentioned, like I love the word hustle because that really describes most of us in college. Like you just have to you have to hustle, as in it means you have to work hard, twice as hard as everyone else, but it also means you have to be resourceful, right? So you got to figure out and be creative because you're forced to be. So that's really what it means to hustle. And I think that's really important when you're in college for anybody, but especially when you're undocumented, right? And that kind of skill where you're resourceful, you find the loopholes and figure out how to do things that no one else can, that is what makes you a better nurse or doctor or lawyer, right? So that kind of hustle really helps even in the workforce. But even job as a waiter, like I had to work on the table as a waiter, but that was a skill that really worked well in nursing where I was multitasking, I was prioritizing, I was doing time management. So by the time I was a nurse, I was like, oh, I can do this. I did it with food. Now you have to deal with medicine and with people. But it actually translates really well. So you'll be surprised how some of your hustle in your college years will really add on to your professional career.
One last question for you for maybe other undocumented young people. So what made you not give up your hope in being a nurse and being able to contribute your skills here?
So for me personally, I'm a Christian, so my faith is what keeps me grounded. So that would always be my hope. But as far as education and as far as like working hard, I think just looking towards my parents and how hard they had to work, that's always my inspiration. My dad had to give up his job when he was laid off as an engineer and came to the U.S. to paint houses. And he was working 7 days a week, right? And he's still working that kind of work ethics. So looking at my dad, that has always set the bar for me of how hard I should work. And that's always been my inspiration.
Thank you.
Kathy, can I address the question about what we would advise young people?
Yeah.
There was sort of an identity that came along with the Dreamer movement, especially as the lead up to DACA, which was undocumented and unafraid. And what we had were a lot of young people who were like Eli, coming forward, sharing their story. As I said, at great personal risk potentially to themselves, of telling people very publicly, I don't have immigration status to be here, and I'm part of a movement to push for this program. One of the fears I think that we as advocates share is that this steady drumbeat against immigrants and targeting of immigrants is really going to send people into the shadows, and this power that people have felt is really being stripped of them. And I think one of the things that we tell young people is that, first of all, keep in mind that the vast majority, somewhere between 70 and 80% of Americans actually want to see a legislative solution. They want to see a law that would allow young people, undocumented people who don't have status, to get a green card, not just a 2-year work permit that can be renewed, but a permanent green card where they can be here legally and permanently and eventually become citizens. The vast majority of Democrats and Republicans want that. So people have to assess what their risk level is that they're comfortable with. But people shouldn't give up that sense of power that they have, that they can really push for things. They still have rights in this country under the Constitution. If they don't want to come out publicly or push for things, if they can't vote, that they should ask other people to do that for them and not have that power stripped away from them. So that's, I think, one thing that we want to tell young people is that most of us are with you, even people in power, even people in Congress, the vast majority, and they shouldn't give up that power.
So I have a question here that maybe is a good transition from there. So this person says, accepting that we want to protect DACA kids, do you agree with any of the arguments to the contrary? That we want to have better control of our borders, that we should try to use a point system to attract higher education immigrants, and that illegal immigrants are jumping the queue over other legitimate refugees. What would the two of you say to any of those concerns or arguments that might actually lead us to ending the DACA program?
Yeah, I mean, I think one is that there has often been floated this idea of a merit-based system, that we have certain kinds of qualities and other people that we decide have more merit for them to be allowed to be in the United States. And I think that's usually around, of course, how people can contribute to the workforce and or the education level that they come to the United States with. And I don't think it recognizes that merit comes in many different forms. One of the cornerstones of our immigration policy and law since for many, many decades has been actually family-based immigration, that we as a nation support families being able to be together, reunifying the vast majority of immigrants that are in the country have gotten that legal status through a family member, and there's merit in that as well. That's what knits our country together as communities. That's what keeps our communities strong. And so I think from our perspective, we also believe in certain kinds of merit, but we don't believe it's just measured by someone's education level or what they contribute to the economy based on the education level. And in fact, many immigrants who come through as refugees or as undocumented immigrants or through a family member actually contribute in many ways to the economy as well. So even if we wanted to commodify people in that way, it's not just based on the education level they come with.
Mm-hmm. Eli, would you have anything to add?
Well, I think that's interesting because they always say you should get back to the line, but there is no line to get back to, right? So like I didn't have the option. It's not like my parents were like, let's go cut in line. We had $300 in our pocket when we came to this country. Like there is no line for you. So that's kind of an arbitrary thing when they say there's a queue that you're cutting into. As far as the point system, I think that's interesting because for dreamers, we've always thought growing up, oh, I wish there was a point system like Canada and Australia. That's how they do it. Under that point system, all of us would qualify. So we're kind of like, well, I wish, if it was that simple, like Australia and Canada, on one hand, it'd be nice without getting rid of the family immigration, right? So I think if it worked hand in hand as a comprehensive thing, it might be a nice thing to simplify our system because it's so complicated in comparison. Mm-hmm. But I don't think we should rule out the family visa as well because that's, I think, much needed. But as far as border security, I think it's also interesting where like 20 years down the road, we legalize all the dreamers, but are there going to be dreamers 20 years from now if the border is still not secure? So that's kind of a legitimate question, I think. Like, at what point are we going to fix this problem? Or are we just putting a Band-Aid to the problem every 20 years by legalizing the dreamers? But 20, 30, 40 years down the road, what's going to happen?
Mm-hmm. I see this also as an issue that's often used to divide immigrant communities. The idea that there is a line, as Eli said, there isn't. But there's a perceived line even in the immigrant community. And we see this as a way to divide sometimes Asian immigrants from Latino immigrants, from undocumented immigrants, from people who have green cards, et cetera. So this policy issue has become really dangerous as a way to sort of create wedges in the community and create a lot of divisiveness. I think it goes along something else that we are often concerned about, which is the image of a good immigrant versus the bad immigrant. That in general, there is a narrative that's being developed among who's deserving, and the level or the standard that they set is much higher than most of us would be able to pass. That comes up in citizenship or the ability to get a green card, but it also seeks to criminalize immigrants and definitely paint the bad immigrant, which our president does kind of repeatedly by talking about people who are criminals, who come from shithole countries, et cetera. We hear that a lot, and it feeds into a deserving or meritorious immigrant and a non-deserving or meritorious immigrant. So a lot of that is really dangerous to thinking about us as communities that include immigrant families.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There's a couple of sort of technical questions about DACA that I think probably both of you can answer, but I'll direct at Sally. So one is about the renewal process. So is the renewal for DACA, does it still have to be done 6 months before the expiration date? Mm-hmm. And can we apply before the 6-month window?
Yeah, so the immigration agency, USCIS, that processes these DACA renewals has said you're supposed to wait 120 to 150 days before your expiration to file. Like, so within 120 or 150 days of when your expiration date is on your work permit, you can file to renew your DACA. There were many people that as soon as that window opened up to renew again, because the federal court said, hey, President Trump, you can't do that. You have to keep allowing renewals. There were a lot of people who like immediately applied, even if their DACA wasn't going to expire for a year or a year and a half, because they wanted to take advantage of this window being open because it might close again. So what we've seen is that people who've renewed even a year or more in advance are having those accepted. They haven't, it's only been about a month that the process has been opened again, so they haven't all been approved, but people can file to renew far in advance, and USCIS is accepting those.
The other technical question about DACA is for Sally. Sally mentioned no new applications will be accepted. Does that include individuals who allowed their status to expire due to fear of the new administration?
Yeah, that's yes. So if anyone has had DACA before as well, they can also apply to renew, even if it lapsed, it expired, or was terminated by the government. They can still file to, technically it's technically they're renewing, but it's confusing because they have to file that on the form that's as an initial applicant. It's pretty technical. I should also mention that here in California, the state has actually invested $45 million into legal services, free legal services, education, and outreach for immigration services in California. So there are a lot of free legal services, particularly in the Bay Area, but also around the state. So people who have questions like that should definitely seek out some of the many free legal services that are available to get for the opportunity to talk to an attorney about their case if they have any question. But the short answer is, if you ever had DACA, even if it lapsed or was terminated, you probably can now file to renew, and you should talk to an attorney if you have any questions.
I think another good reason to talk to a legal service provider, not only to think about your DACA case or to investigate your DACA case, is also because there might be other immigration remedies, more long-term immigration remedies that you might be eligible for. I think in most surveys, about 15 to 20% of DACA beneficiaries were actually eligible for other more durable remedies.
That's right. Many DACA recipients might already be eligible for a green card and not know it. So it's important to get an immigration screening.
I have a question here about Trump, President Trump. It says, please discuss Trump's concern about DACA. What in particular do you think he wants changed? And how do you perceive Trump using DACA as a political football to getting funding or support for the border wall?
So I'll start. President Trump has talked about DACA and Dreamers for years, since before he became president. It's really hard to track what he thinks and what he feels. It's gone back and forth. He has said he loves the Dreamers. He has said he would sign any bill that included a DREAM Act provision. And then later he said he would only do so if it actually was one of the 4 pillars. He has 4 pillars that he would like to see passed in an immigration bill. Those 4 pillars include a way to get green cards for the DACA recipients and or a broader range of so-called Dreamers. One of the pillars is that he wants to get rid of the diversity visa program, which benefits about 50,000 people a year from countries that don't have a lot of people seeking visas or getting visas in the United States. One would be to restrict family-based immigration. Earlier I talked about that that's a cornerstone for our immigration policy. He would like to see severe restrictions so that U.S. citizens and green card holders would not be able to petition as many family members as they currently can. And of course he wants funding and support for his border wall idea and policy. So it's hard to know. I mean, definitely it feels like Dreamers and DACA recipients are being used as a bargaining chip. They are being, their lives are being put at stake for this idea of having either a real physical or some kind of additional resources at the border. So he's gone back and forth so often about this issue that it's really hard to say what ultimately he'll do and what he'll support. I don't know how that's felt to you, Eli.
I mean, he's a politician. Well, he's a businessman and a negotiator, and they have all the leverage, right? So if you are a businessman or a negotiator, you're going to work that leverage, right? And that's what he's doing. So I'm not surprised. That's part of his character. But that's also nature of politics, right? It's kind of a mean game. And on both sides of the spectrum, I think they're guilty of playing games with DACA and DREAM Act. So I'm not necessarily thinking like, he's worse than Obama or whatever. I think on both sides, they've taken advantage of the situation for their own political gain. So.
Changing gears, there's a question here. What do you think would happen to kids without their parents who might get deported? So I'm wondering if you're comfortable, Eli, talking about from your own family or families that you know, kind of preparations that families might do with the thought of someone being deported. And maybe, Sally, then you can talk just sort of generally about what we're seeing in the immigrant community about sort of reaction and preparation.
Yeah, I'm not sure what would exactly happen, but I know that my relatives are still undocumented, right? And their children are dreamers. So in that case, it'd be devastating, right? I mean, if they were being deported, I don't know who would take care of them. I don't know if they would go into foster system. It would devastate their whole family. So that's not something that we really thought about or planned too much, but that might be a reality in the near future if things continue to become more aggressive and escalate.
Mm-hmm. There have been there's been a lot of reports and studies that have come out about the mental health crisis for not just undocumented immigrants, but really all immigrants in this country, and the ways that the threat of deportation is showing up in very young children. Anxiety, tremendous amount of anxiety, fear of leaving the house, fear of really talking about themselves or their families to other people, many different physical manifestations of sort of that anxiety. I think we've seen also it maybe is the most damaging to younger children because they aren't really aware of what's going on, so they sort of feel the tension and anxiety of their parents, but have really no way to be able to process that and understand it with other people. And older people who do have a sense of the politics and sort of what is at play might have a greater sort of systemic understanding. And might even be able to discuss it with their parents. But Sally, what are some of the ways that the immigrant community is tangibly preparing for the threat of deportation?
Yeah, I think a lot of times people wonder, like, well, if you're married to a U.S. citizen, aren't you kind of protected, or don't you guys just get citizenship through that spouse? Or if someone if they're undocumented and they have a U.S. citizen kid, aren't they allowed some kind of mercy or pardon or some way that they could stay? And the answer, at least in that second question, is no. Not just because you have a U.S. citizen child doesn't mean that you'll be granted any kind of ability to stay here. So the targeting of parents and families will tear families apart. So just yesterday, actually probably many of you saw over the weekend, Mayor Libby Schaaf in Oakland let her community know that she had heard from credible sources that there may be immigration enforcement and activities in the community, including arrests. And as of this morning, I think we know of at least 50 or so that happened in Northern California. In some of those cases, people were picked up outside their homes, at a convenience store and other places, and were back in Mexico within hours later that night. So you can imagine your dad going down to the 7-Eleven to pick up something, and next thing you know, he's in another country. So we have, a lot of advocates have talked to people about how to prepare. And years ago, we actually started this effort trying to get people to think about preparedness. And it's a little bit like talking to people about preparing your will or, your advanced healthcare directive if you were to become critically ill. And a lot of people don't want to think about that. What we found lately is that actually people really do want to prepare. To think about what is going to happen to my children if I'm detained or deported and I have U.S. citizen children. Do I want them to come back with me to my home country, or would I want them to stay here? And if they were to stay here, what do I want their care plan to look like? We found actually a lot of people now want to do that. It's kind of in an environment that feels out of one's own control. It allows people to take control over some of their own desires, to think about, okay, if I were to be detained and deported, maybe my US citizen friend Eli could actually be the one that picks my kids up, that takes them in the short term, while maybe I figure out even how to bring them home or how to think about having them placed with a guardian somewhere else. But many immigrant families are having those conversations now, and they're difficult to talk to children about, to talk to your own child and say, I could get detained, but don't worry. If I'm detained and I don't come home that day, we have a plan. Auntie Kathy's going to pick you up, is going to take care of you. Actually, a lot of people are finding that reassuring and a way to sort of embrace their own power. The other thing we find is that immigrants are really learning their rights under the Constitution and how to assert the same rights that citizens have to remain silent or to not open their door when ICE officials come to their home or their workplace, that they don't have to, that they can assert the same rights that any of us can to remain silent or to keep their door closed if the ICE agent doesn't have a judicial warrant. So a lot of people are exercising those rights and making those plans.
Thanks, Sally. Here's a question about what other options might be available to people since it's no longer possible for people to apply for DACA. So what happens to those who are fleeing their countries because of violence, gangs, the economy? Are there any programs to support these people, any organizations to support them? So maybe we can, Sally, you can talk about the other immigration remedies that might be, that people should know about for young people who are here currently without any legal status.
Yeah, so Kathy mentioned earlier that some reports and surveys and research showed that somewhere between 15 and sometimes as high as 38% of DACA recipients are actually eligible for some other immigration option. That's actually in the undocumented community in general, not just DACA recipients, that there are many people who are probably eligible for some benefit already that exists under immigration law. So some of the most common ones are, we have various forms of humanitarian kinds of visas. So for example, victims of crime, if you're a victim of a crime in the United States and you're helpful to the criminal investigation or prosecution of that crime, you may be eligible for a visa that would eventually lead to a green card and citizenship. This is partially because it's a humanitarian benefit and also partially because law enforcement advocated for a visa because they needed the immigrant community, like the entire community, to be unafraid to report crimes and help out in investigations. So there are visas like that for victims of human trafficking, for victims of crime. There's a program, an asylum program for people who can demonstrate a fear of persecution based on either their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, membership in a social group, so a subset of people that are afraid to go back to their home countries. There are many people who have been in the country undocumented for a long time who at this point do have family members that maybe could petition them, especially if we don't curb family immigration under Trump's proposed policies. So those are some of the most common ones, but there are some people who are seeking sometimes employment visas and other options that are available. Again, it's why we're really pushing all undocumented immigrants to go in and get an immigration screening. The laws change, individuals' personal circumstances change, and all of those could affect what they may be eligible for now.
Thank you. So I'm going to take just one more question here, and that is, how can people support DACA recipients every day? So I will give Eli the opportunity to answer that first.
I feel like just sharing our stories, whether it be social media or through just your circle of friends. I think stories are very powerful, and the more we share our stories, the more we raise awareness about DACA. And I think public support is important, right? Because that's eventually going to affect the policies. So I think influencing the public opinion and just spreading the news about like what is DACA and why is it so hard and why is it such a problem.
Thank you.
I just want to piggyback on that because the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is the federal agency in charge of approving DACA cases and visas and citizenship, just announced that they were actually going to remove a phrase from the mission statement of the USCIS, which was the part that addresses that we are a nation of immigrants. They're purposely stripping that out of the identity of USCIS. And I think this idea of sharing our stories, not just that we're really have been asking undocumented youth, share your story, you know, become the spokesperson for this movement and the model so everyone will want to support it. But I think a lot of us have immigrant stories that we can share as well. For some of us, it's from our background. For some of us, it's the immigrants in our community that we know and recognize. And I think keeping it alive that we're a nation of immigrants and that we recognize and appreciate that both helps the individual DACA recipients not feel so alone, and is a reminder that that this is the fabric of our community that makes us strong.
I would just add that I think that it's important to tell DACA beneficiaries that they're not alone in this. I'm someone who is very solutions-oriented and wants to take action, but I think it's also very useful for us to just show our solidarity with people by sitting and listening to them and hearing how they're doing, telling them that we want them in this country, that we're committed to them, that we don't have the answers ourselves, but that we are committed to just being present and to hearing about these sort of ups and downs and the sort of the struggles and what it takes to be resilient. I'm still struck by sort of your analogy about that it feels like you're being bombed every single day, and to just give someone the sense that really that they're not alone and that we want you in this country here with us. We need you here in this country. So thank you so much to Sally and Eli, and thank you so much to you in the audience.
Thank you.